this single hack could 10x your gains. And I honestly think that if this isn't in place in your program, it could be the difference between gaining about 1 pound of muscle per year and 10 pounds of muscle, hence 10x. So this is something that you can start making sure of today to grow more muscle. And when I figured this out in my own program, I definitely went from gaining at kind of a slow rate to really hitting the accelerator button on my gains. And it really took the guesswork of kind of knowing what I'm doing in the gym. So before I kind of get to this hack, or the one thing that I think that you should focus on, let's first talk about what's kind of most important when it comes to muscle growth. Some people will kind of be like, is it your training or is it your nutrition? And I personally think that the correct answer to this is actually your training, as without your training, you're not going to provide a stimulus for growth. Yes, there are studies to where people jump on the juice and then they don't even train at all and they gain some muscle, but we're not talking about that here. For the average guy going in the gym looking to grow muscle, I think it's more important to focus on getting your training right, as you could eat all the protein you want in the world, but you're not going to grow muscle if that stimulus isn't there. And the way that I like to think about it is your training is what's going to drive muscle hypertrophy, whereas your nutrition is going to be more permissive to hypertrophy. Yes, there's a certain amount of protein and calories you probably need to eat to permit muscle growth to occur, at least at the fastest rate possible. But if your stimulus isn't right, you're not going to be growing. So now that we've established that training is definitely one piece that you really need to have dialed in, when it comes to your training, what seems to be the kind of most important variable that you can manipulate that's going to cause the most growth? Well, this seems to be your training volume. How many hard sets you're doing per muscle per week. This seems to be one of the most important things when it comes to your training. So if we're thinking about something that's going to 10x our gains, well, we should probably focus on what's going to be like the most important thing, or what's going to have the biggest effect size when it comes to growing muscle. And I think it's getting your training volume dialed in, or getting that training stimulus dialed in. And that is indeed the hack. The hack is making sure that you are training with an effective training volume. So how do you know if you're training in an effective training volume range? Well, there's kind of 2 points to consider here. One point is your minimum effective dose, or your minimum effective volume, also called your MEV. This is the minimum amount of volume or hard sets per muscle per week that is going to elicit a significant amount of muscle hypertrophy. And then we also have, on the flip side, the second point is your MRV, your maximum recoverable volume, the most amount of volume, hard sets per muscle per week, that you can actually recover from. And if you stay within these 2 points, you ensure that you are doing an effective amount of training volume to grow muscle. And if you train too much, well, you're not going to recover, and recovery is required for adaptation. So you're also not going to make your adaptations. And if you train too little, well, that stimulus just isn't going to be effective to gain at a robust pace. So how do you know if you're training enough? Well, there's a few different indicators that I like to look at that, when thinking about these together, you can decide if you are indeed training enough. And one of these indicators is getting some following day soreness or fatigue, especially in the muscles that tend to get sore or fatigued. So these tend to be things like your triceps, your chest, your quads, your hamstrings. Do these muscles at least feel some following day soreness and fatigue? A second indicator I like to look at is the muscle pump. When you were training that muscle, did it at least get a bit of a muscle pump? And then the third indicator is just a subjective rating of how challenging a workout felt for a particular muscle group. Did it feel really hard? Did it feel really easy? And when you look at these indicators together, I think you can really get a good idea if a certain training stimulus was effective for you. So if you got some following day fatigue, you got a good muscle pump in those muscle groups, and it felt subjectively pretty challenging, well, that stimulus was probably effective. And on the flip side, if you got no muscle pump, you got no following day fatigue and soreness, and it felt subjectively easy, it very well could have been below your minimum effective volume. Now, I wouldn't say that just because you don't have one of these, it means it wasn't effective. Like if you had no soreness, but you got a really good pump and it felt fairly challenging, I would still say that's probably in your kind of effective training range. So I like to look at those 3 indicators to know if I'm training enough or if my clients are training enough. Now, how do you know if you're training too much? Well, there's a few different indicators you can look here as well. My favorite one is probably overlapping soreness and fatigue. If you train your chest on Monday and it's still sore when you go to train it on Thursday, well, that Monday session was probably above the maximum amount of volume that you can recover from, and it was probably a bit too much. A second indicator I like to look at here is your performance. If your performance is consistently decreasing across all lifts, that could be a big red flag that maybe you're just trying to push it too much. Now, this should also be looked at with your other indicators. And another indicator you can look at alongside this is just your subjective feeling of, do you feel pretty beat up in your training program? If you feel pretty beat up and you're maybe a little bit more irritable throughout the day and you're having a harder time sleeping and you're just generally kind of achy and sore and your performance is decreasing and you're noticing some overlapping soreness and fatigue, that is a clear indicator that you probably need an overall deload and you're training above your maximum recoverable volume. But if you don't notice any overlapping soreness or fatigue, you don't notice that you're just subjectively feeling beat up, your performance is at least maintaining across the mesocycle, then you're probably not above your maximum recoverable volume. So that's what I like to look at to find kind of that minimum effective dose and that maximum recoverable dose. And as long as you're training between these 2 points, you ensure that your training is effective. Now, where's a good place to start for your kind of minimum effective volume? Well, I think a great starting place for most people is about 8 to 10 sets per muscle per week. And these are direct sets. And what is usually a good kind of a maximum recoverable volume for people? What point do they get in which they might not be able to recover from it a whole lot? Usually, with my experience of coaching clients over the last several years, this range tends to fall in between about 16 to 20 sets. So generally, for most people, I think that their MEV is going to be in that 8 to 10 set range, and their maximum recoverable volume is going to be in that kind of 16 to 20 set range. And I think that if you ensure that you're training with an effective volume and you weren't training with an effective volume before, you can quite literally 10x your gains. Now, this will increase your odds, like I said, of 10xing your results. But if you want to increase your odds further, then I would check out this video on 12 rules for getting jacked.